Hello everyone, this week we'll be talking about finding and citing sources. So there will be more information on Canvas about A&M Central Texas resources specifically, but this lecture will provide some basic information about how to find appropriate sources and how we define what an appropriate source might be and how to cite them in your references page. Okay, so one important difference that you are able to identify is whether we're talking about a popular or a scholarly article. Okay, so there's a couple of differences between popular and scholarly articles. One is the author. So in a popular article, this is an article published for a general audience. Normally the author is a journalist, as opposed to a scholarly article, which is published by the scientist who conducted the research, or written by the scientist who conducted the research. The audience is also different. So in a popular article, the audience is not expected to have any specific knowledge on the topic. They're just reading what's interesting to them. As opposed to for a scholarly article, the assumption is that the person reading the article has some technical or specific skills or understanding. There's also a different editorial process. And so in a popular article, the focus is really on what will sell the most magazines, what will get the most views. You've probably heard the term clickbait titles, where the focus is on how can we get people to click on this link. In contrast, a scholarly article is peer-reviewed. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but a peer-reviewed basically means that a panel of experts in the area have read the information and have agreed that it's accurate and presented fairly. There are also additional features. So scientific articles include things like abstracts, tables, and graphs, describe their methods and results and references. Popular articles generally do not have these things. And so we need to be very careful with popular articles. They tend to be kind of biased towards their audience or sensationalized. And so we need to be critical and careful about when and how we use them. Okay, so another important difference is primary versus secondary literature. So when we're talking about primary research, we're talking about publication of an investigator or a researcher's own research. So normally this is an empirical research article where a scientist has designed a study, collected the data, run the analyses, and they are describing the data that they collected. In contrast, secondary sources are based on primary research, and they're describing multiple sources that are combined in new ways. So examples of these are meta-analyses and a literature review, and again, we'll talk about these from a couple of different angles. For your final paper, you will be creating a secondary source. You're going to be reading primary sources and combining them and using them as evidence to support your thesis statement. Both primary and secondary sources can be peer-reviewed, but you will be focusing hopefully on primary sources for your paper, although you may use a few secondary sources. Okay, so oftentimes, both in this class but also in other classes, you might be asked to find peer-reviewed empirical research. And I want to make sure that you are clear on that term. Sometimes this is also primary research. Sometimes this is called a research article. Sometimes it's called an IMRAD article. And so basically what we're talking about is peer-reviewed. So peer-reviewed, again, we talked about experts in the field have evaluated and provided feedback. In an empirical article, it is a primary source in that the research is conducted by the person who wrote the article, and the article is describing new research evidence. So this is in contrast to something like a literature review or a meta-analysis, where the article is describing other people's research evidence or previously collected data. So if you're trying to decide if an article is a peer-reviewed research study, I think this infographic is kind of helpful. So the first thing you want to look at is whether it was published in a scholarly publication. Okay, so if it was not, then maybe it's popular press. So it's a popular as opposed to a scholarly article written for the general public. If it was published in a scholarly publication, that's a good step. So then you move on. Does it begin with an abstract? So does it have a summary of the article? Does it have a literature review? This summarizes the previous literature on the topic. If not, then you're probably looking at a popular article written for the general public. If yes, and if it includes a list of references, then you're probably in the right track. So you probably have at least a peer-reviewed article. Next, the question is it a primary research article? So is it written by the researchers and describing an original study? If not, you may have a literature review or a meta-analysis. If yes, then the things to look for are, does it have a method section? Does it have a results section? And does it have a discussion section? If it has these three sections, then it's a really good indicator that you have found a peer-reviewed empirical article or a peer-reviewed research article. Another acronym you might hear, I know the folks at the library like to use this, is an IMRAD article. It's describing the exact same thing. IMRAD stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. So if an article has all of these sections, then it is definitely most likely a peer-reviewed article. So looking for these sections, the introduction won't necessarily be labeled as the introduction, but the method, results, and discussion should each be labeled. If it has these sections, it's a good indicator you're on the right track. A couple other types of sources you might see. So I'll show you, you'll see how to find sources on EBSCO, but even on our library databases, you might find other types of articles. We talked about that peer review process. And so when we're talking about peer review versus non-peer review, we're talking about the publication process. Has it been read and evaluated by experts in the field? Now, depending again on the assignment, some of these types of sources may or may not be acceptable. Okay, when we're talking about a peer-reviewed source that is not an empirical source, peer review processes might also be used for a literature review. So there might be a review of literature that doesn't include any new data, but that has been through the peer review process. Another type of study you might see is a meta-analysis. So this is where the authors collect previous data from other published studies and reanalyze it. So a meta-analysis is kind of a gray area where it's definitely useful for background information. It may or may not work depending on your assignment. With a meta-analysis, they're not really collecting their own data, but they are running new analyses on previously collected data, and it is peer-reviewed. You may also come across non-peer-reviewed articles on EBSCO. Particularly, it tends to list dissertations. So dissertations have not been through the peer review process. So they will not count if you are required to find a peer review article. Dissertations can still be useful even if you can't include them. They might be useful for your literature review or finding other articles. So you don't necessarily need to throw them away, but keep in mind that they haven't been through that peer review process. And again, popular media articles, we've talked extensively about those, and they have not been peer reviewed. Okay, so when you are looking at an article, especially if you are looking for a peer-reviewed empirical article, this is a list of things to look for that might be helpful for you. So one is it in a peer-reviewed journal? And we'll show you how you can actually filter peer-reviewed on EBSCO. Does it have an abstract? Almost all peer-reviewed articles should have an abstract, that brief summary at the beginning of the article. Does it have a method section? One thing that kind of tells me right away if it's an empirical article is if it tells me 354 people participated in the study. Obviously, they're collecting new data. If it lists the specific measures or procedures that were used, again, that tells you that it is an empirical article because they're collecting new data. A results section is another really clear way to identify, is it an empirical article? Did they run their analyses and describe them? The discussion section as well, and sometimes it's called the conclusions instead, or discussion and conclusions, but there should be some kind of information after the references section, or after the results section. And then an empirical article will include references, but a peer-reviewed article will also include references. Okay, so I'm going to give you kind of the very brief of how to conduct a literature search, and you can review, and we'll go through more specific details in another video. But when you're conducting a literature search, when you're trying to find information on your topic, the best place to look is the library. The library has a ton of search engines and article databases, which will be kind of the primary way that you access academic journals. So when we're talking about peer-reviewed empirical research, it is published in academic journals. And so we have a great library website that gives us access to all kinds of academic journals. And so this is really the best resource. The library also offers books, which some students use, but certainly the majority of new research is published in these academic journals that are readily accessible online. EBSCO is the best database we have to conduct a literature search. You can search by author, you can search by year. EBSCO has these and or functions. So the and function is if you are combining two different topics. If you want to know about alcoholism and memory, right? You would put alcoholism in one search bar, use the and then memory. That way you are pulling up all articles that mention both alcoholism and memory. Now, if you have a couple of different words that might represent whatever you're studying. So maybe I'm curious about memory and alcoholism or alcohol abuse. I can use that alcohol function and it will pull up any article that talks about either memory and alcohol or memory and alcoholism or memory and alcohol abuse. So that or function allows you to kind of broaden your search by using a couple of different words for the same construct. You can also filter your searches by peer review. So there's a peer review button on the left that you'll see in the EBSCO host video. And you can also modify your search results. Okay, so when you are doing a search on EBSCO and you find an article that you're interested in, this is what you will see. This has most of the information that you will need to write a references page. So this page for each article has the title, it's got the author's name. In source, it tells us the journal, the volume, the page number. It will tell us the DOI down here if it has one. And so a lot of this information can be found in the article itself as well. But this is really useful to have it listed here, especially if sometimes articles are missing some of this information. You can always go back to EBSCO. Another important thing to look for is the PDF copy. So ideally, the way we're saving our articles is by saving the PDF full text of the article. So that's what you want to look for, and that's a way to ensure that you can get the article, can download it and save it so that you can keep going back to it. Okay, so when you can access an article on PDF, it will look like this, and when you have the PDF, you'll be able to see the article exactly as it looked when it was published. This is what you want to save, and so you might need a download button or the little floppy disk. However you save PDF copies. I cannot emphasize this enough. Links in EBSCO or any of the other databases tend to go bad and they tend to not work, or they don't work for other people. You need to save the article as a PDF. Make sure that you can locate it on your computer so that you will always have access to that article, no matter what happens with EBSCO or where you put the link. Okay, so again, EBSCO has tools that you can save things to your EBSCO account. Sometimes things disappear. Save your article as a PDF, save it somewhere where you can find it. It's the only way to guarantee you will continue to have access. Now, what I recommend is that you save it as something that you will be able to identify. A lot of students save it as Article 1, Article 2. This gets confusing when you have 15 articles. So instead, save it with some keywords, and better yet, save it with the authors and some keywords. So I recommend using this format. So if the authors are Barron and Dolan in 2013, you would save it as Barron Dolan 13, and then we've got some keywords here: online choices, multiple memory. Okay, so those keywords, as I'm looking through my articles trying to figure out which one I want to cite or which one I want to read, should trigger me to think, oh yeah, this is the article I wanted. Whereas if I just label them article 1, 2, 3, I'm going to have no idea what the content of that article is. Okay, so additional places that you can find sources. One is a textbook. So if you're doing a paper on memory and you have, you still have your book from cognitive psychology, maybe you go back and reread that or look at that. A textbook is a secondary source. However, it will cite primary sources, so you can use it as ideas for what primary sources are important. We're going to talk about the internet in a moment. We talked about article databases and other library resources. Our library staff is excellent. So if you are struggling to find things, go to them. Book an appointment to see a librarian, and they will help you figure out how you need to revise your search to find it. Another really important source is if you can only find 1 or 2 articles, but those 1 or 2 articles seem really relevant, look at the references on those articles. So see who those articles cite. And so kind of you get this snowball effect where you find one good article, you look at their references and find a couple more. You can look at those references and find a few more. And this is a really great way to get your literature search going, especially if you're struggling to figure out the right key terms. Another place you might find sources is the internet. So internet sources will not be allowed for your final paper in this class, but many may be used for other classes, or you're definitely going to encounter them in the real world, so you need to know how to evaluate them. There is a web literacy tutorial for you to complete on Canvas this week, and this gives you a really great idea for how to use and evaluate internet sources. So make sure you go through that and use that for your assignment. A couple other things to be thinking about when you're evaluating the internet source. You want to remember that they may serve as a starting point. So we were talking about formulating ideas, about using Wikipedia to focus your topic. When you have an idea for a topic and want to kind of narrow it down, you might start there. So some things to think about though as you're deciding, is this a reliable source? You want to think about the accuracy, right? So is the information provided consistent with other sources? Have they done stuff like list references, used basic grammatical standards? If there's typos in every sentence, probably a sign that it's not a very accurate source. You might also think about the authority. So who is taking credit? Does the author have an appropriate and relevant credentials? Is there contact information, or is it an anonymous blog that's posted by someone who has just a username that you can't identify who wrote it? In contrast, if you've got, I don't know, a PhD professor who is, writing about the topic that is their area of expertise, you might believe that and give that source a little more authority. We also think about objectivity or advocacy. So what is the purpose of the site? You can look at things like the domain name, and the web tutorial will have you do a lot of that. Could the purpose affect what's included or excluded? And does it present different perspectives? Does it give fair and balanced information? Think about how current the information was. When was it originally written and updated? Are the links current and working? If it was published in 2001 and none of the links work anymore, probably not a great source. Coverage too. So is the information fair and comprehensive? Do they present multiple sides? How do they treat each side? Is there support for outside ideas? Lots of different types of sources. Some are high quality and some are not. And so practicing the skill of evaluating sources is really important. Okay, so next we're going to talk about, once you find your sources, how are you going to cite them? There are 2 basic ways we cite sources in APA. In the text that you're writing, or in presentations, we use in-text citations where we give the author's credit by listing their last name and the year of publication. We'll cover that more when you actually start writing. But to start with, we're going to talk about the references list. So the references list includes all of the relevant information your reader needs to know in order to find the articles that you have cited. So the references list is a list of works that you have referred to in your paper. It includes, it's not a works cited paper, but in your paper, your references list should only include things that you have actually cited in the text. Okay, so you don't list every article you ever looked at. You need to make sure that your references list is a reflection of what you have cited in your paper, and you don't have extra things in it, but you do cite everything. So when you make a references list, for this class we're focusing on academic references, peer-reviewed journals. The easiest thing to do when you're making a references list is figure out what type of source do you have. Are you looking at a book? Are you looking at a scholarly journal article? Are you looking at a web page? Find an example of that type of source. I've got a link here. Either you can use your APA guide. This is a link online. Purdue OWL is a great place. Find an example of a journal article citation, mirror that sample, and then list your references, order your references in alphabetical order by the author's last name. So in general, the title references goes at the top of your references page. It should be centered and bolded. The entire references page should be double spaced. And it should be flush left with the first line. So the very first line goes all the way to the left margin, and subsequent lines are indented. And you're going to order entries alphabetically by the author's last name. Now note, you never rearrange the order of authors within an article. That order is determined by how much work people did, but you would put the citation for Avery and colleagues before the citation for Boyson and colleagues. So you're going to organize them by the first author's last name. All right, so these are examples of what sources from a journal should look like. Keep in mind that in your paper, they should be double spaced and Times New Roman. So great basic start. And again, there's lots of places you can see these. We start with the author's last name and then first and middle initials. Even if the article actually lists the author's first or middle name, all you put in the citation is initials. Then the year of publication, even if the day or month is listed, all we put is the year. Then we have the article title. Now note that the article title is using what's called sentence case. Basically what this means is the only thing that are capitalized are the first letter, the first letter after a colon, and proper nouns. Okay, so those are the 3 times, so names or places. Those are the only times that you capitalize a word in your journal, in your article title. Next, you have the journal title. The journal title is using title case. And so now, basically, all of the big words are capitalized. So we don't capitalize of or and, but you can see that the majority of words are capitalized. The journal title should be in italics, followed by a comma, and then the volume is in italics. And then immediately after the volume, you have the issue number in parentheses. For some reason, volume is italicized, issue is not. And then you have a comma, and then you have page numbers. No P's before page numbers, you just list the page numbers. And then this DOI stands for Digital Object Identifier. So every article has a DOI, New APA says that we need to get it so that the DOI is a hyperlink. So you should be able to find this when you find the journal on EBSCO, if not on the article itself. This is an example of books. Most people won't be using books, but you have this as a resource if you do, and you can always go back to your APA manual. Many people cite the DSM in their papers. So the DSM is kind of the manual of psychological disorders. So if you are citing the DSM, the author for that is the American Psychiatric Association. And so I've included how to cite it both in text and in references just because it's a little complicated and not necessarily obvious. Okay, so finally I've got a little try it yourself activity. If you don't know how to use the EBSCO database, I would pause this and go watch the resources on that first. Because what I'd like you to do is get on A&M Central Texas EBSCO and look for an article by David Strayer and William Johnson that was published in 2001. So you've got the author's names and the years, and you'll need to use those as a search criteria. I want you to cite the article in APA format as if it's in your references list. So use this material to create an APA style citation. Then I want you to read the abstract and paraphrase the study findings in your own words. So just like we talked about last week, this is your opportunity to practice that. Read the abstract, cover it up, and then write about the study in your own words. And finally, I would like you to save a PDF copy of the article somewhere that you can find it and then retrieve it. Go back and make sure it's where you think it is. These are going to be important skills for you to practice. So once you have finished, pause this and go do that. And then once you've finished, some of these I can't give you the right answers to, but here is the APA citations and an example of how you might summarize it.